Back. We are up to lesson 8. I think I can get rid of one of those S's there. Modern economic liberalism. After today's lesson, you should be able to discuss the presence of modern economic liberalism here in Canada. You should be able to discuss the elements of the economy that warrant regulation. You should be able to understand that nations that embrace even more economic collectivism than Canada, and you should be able to engage in that argument of freedom versus control. Now, the document that I've shared out with you here is 14 pages, but there's 2 key prezzies within it that we're going to spend the majority of our time looking at. So, the main topic we're looking at is what elements of the economy warrant intervention, and what does the government do today in Canada within the economy. So here's a nice cartoon I thought we could look at to get us started. One way the government regulates the economy is to tax individuals and corporations within it, but then they use that taxment to invest in different services within the economy. Things like public health and welfare, education, roads, parks, rec, sanitation, etc. So this is a cartoon that I think really captures the essence of modern economic liberalism, because within the cartoon we see that new relationship between government and governed where we are taxed, but in return for those taxes we expect a complete list of services from the government. So I'm going to go to these 2 prezzies, and these 2 prezzies are going to be the majority of what we talk about. So here we are with one of the 2 prezzies. What elements of the market warrants government intervention? So this prezzy can really help you with your essays. That, if you're writing an economic essay in August or whenever you end up writing that diploma exam, when you write your economic essay, you need to be able to distinguish what parts of the economy do warrant government intervention and what parts of the economy should the government keep a hands-off approach. And that's what we're going to try to accomplish through this prezzy. So one of the considerations for regulation of the economy would be, what impact does the product that you're offering to the marketplace have on the environment? So for example, some corporations have created pesticides and herbicides and different fertilizers that may have a toxic effect on the biosphere. And if the product that you're producing creates a death of birth, if it ends up changing different organisms within that ecosystem at a genomic level, then perhaps it's in the best interest of society to regulate that. There may be some chemicals that we don't want introduced into our food supply. There are chemicals that are known carcinogens. We don't want to be exposed to carcinogens, even if the carcinogen happens to be a handy way of dealing with some kind of pest in our community. So Monsanto has done many things. It's a corporation that has created many products, but one of its products it created was Agent Orange for the U.S. military in their fight in Vietnam. And Monsanto also has genetically modified certain crops so that there's a terminator technology, meaning that the seed cannot be stored for a future growing season, that the seed itself will terminate. So many critics of Monsanto have said that this is the death of birth, that you have created birth, you've created this seed that by design, by genetic design, there's a terminator technology within the seed's design so that farmers can't save some of their seed from this year to next. So now you become dependent upon Monsanto. Another industry that, for environmental reasons, many might say needs to be regulated, would be whaling. That there are certain species on this planet, like whales, that may be endangered, and because they're endangered, maybe humanity has a obligation to protect them. There's another documentary, Food Incorporated, that looks at the pastoral fantasy that is our food, and the idea that our food, the food that we ate, the food that we consume often ends up surviving horrific conditions before it gets to our plate. And some of the slaughterhouses, some of the different chicken coops and things like that, where these animals don't even get to move around, shows that it might not be in the best interest of the animal, and it might also not be in the best interest of the consumer. Now, an inconvenient truth about our impact on the environment is that a lot of people like to shame Alberta, but we should be focused on other people. The United States and China also have a tremendous ecological footprint that is an inconvenient truth for the entire planet. So Alberta seems to be getting a lot of bad publicity because of our oil and natural gas industry. But when you look at it globally, if we want to look at the inconvenient truth of who are the climate changers, it's not Alberta. We need to be looking at China and the United States. The seal hunt, because it's on a white canvas and blood on a white canvas becomes quite horrific. The seal hunt is very controversial, and some would say that it warrants government intervention. There's people protesting the oil industry. What elements of the market warrant government intervention? Well, maybe it's a potential revenue source for the government. Maybe the government should intervene in this industry because by intervening, they can create revenue that they can then fund schools and hospitals and fix roads so that I don't lose my front tire in a pothole. So, in Quebec, they have Hydro-Quebec. We also have regulation of the distribution of alcohol so that alcohol is taxed and some of that tax money can be reinvested in social health. The argument has been made that perhaps there should be a greater government presence in Alberta's natural gas and oil industry that, had the profit that has been collected in Alberta the last decades been more public wealth rather than private wealth, much of that private wealth being exported to other countries, then Alberta would be a much different province today. What elements of the market warrant government intervention? Well, maybe products where consumers fail to make good decisions for themselves. So, like heroin, that needs to be regulated. Or like our choices in terms of what kind of automobiles we drive, or what kind of fuels we burn, or what kind of food we eat. Does the government have a parental responsibility to regulate our behavior when our behavior is self-destructive? Or when our behavior is destructive to the group? What elements of the market warrant government intervention? Products that are not suitable for all. Products may be suitable for some, but maybe not everyone has the training and the respect for firearms to be an owner of firearms. So do we regulate who can own a firearm? Or can anyone? Can 3-year-old Russ McBride own a firearm? That's why we put parental advisories on different music and concerts, that there's an advisory that, what you're about to see is not appropriate for all ages. We may also want the government to regulate things because of safety of the services involved. That when the air industry regulated itself, planes started dropping from the sky. So as a part of the Reaganomics revolution in America, the industry was allowed to self-regulate, but in its moments of self-regulation, they decided that they could cut back on how many hours of maintenance per hours in the sky. And when you stop maintaining planes, they do unfortunately start to crash. Products that have caused social and economic harm to others might need to be regulated. Maybe sweatshops need to be regulated. Essential goods during times of crisis. So what's a product that should be regulated? Well, during a time of crisis, and we've lived through some times of crisis recently, we want to make sure that people have maybe equal or equitable access to life-saving goods, life-altering goods. So during wartime, during World War I and World War II, there was rationing of different essentials for your diet. things like sugar and tea and coffee, that even if you had enough money, you weren't allowed to buy more than what the government was rationing. Maybe essential services should be delivered by the government so that things that are essential to our lifestyle can be regulated, that the price of it can be regulated. There's no reason, perhaps, that the price of gasoline should be equivalent to the price of Coca-Cola. Now, unfortunately, when governments don't regulate something as essential as food, and food prices begin to fluctuate quite extremely, revolutions seem to pop up. So in terms of the stability of the system itself, the social, political, and economic sustainability and the stability of the state, it's in the best interest of the government to regulate those prices. As we saw with the French Revolution, one of the main causes of the French Revolution was that people couldn't afford food. The price of bread was too high. This guy is saying rent is too damn high. And if you look at the prices, a 2-bedroom apartment for nearly $9,000 a month, I might have to agree. So some would say that it is hard for others to live in a society where rents are that high. So maybe the government needs to put in rent control so we don't have people that are working homeless. Scams need to be regulated. We need to be protected from online scams. We need to be protected from products that say they're one thing, but actually it's a cheap imitation. So it's not Nike, it's Likey. And it can be very embarrassing going to basketball practice and sporting the wrong shoes, let me tell you that. Key industries for national security need to be regulated. So there might be certain things like Lockheed Martin that are in the weapons industry in America that the US government doesn't want Lockheed Martin or Boeing trading those products to potential enemies of the state like China or Russia or Iraq. Here in Canada, maybe that's the argument behind creating Petro-Canada. The creation of NASA in the United States was spurred by American unpreparedness. At the time, the Soviet Union had launched Sputnik, and the Americans were seeing their satellites blowing up on the launch pad. What if the government's vision is misdirected? That's possible too. This cartoon is being very critical of FDR. From our last lesson, this cartoon is suggesting that the New Deal is billions of dollars being spent that are just being washed away because there's leaks in the pump itself, that the pump that is the New Deal is inefficient. And the real burden is on the taxpayers because eventually someone has to pay for all that money government likes to spend. Is government intervention harmful due to the nature of man? Can it create a culture of dependence? Can government create a culture of dependence where you look at the government as your means to your economic ends? All right. So, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to look at the crisis of credit in a future lesson when we look at the financial market meltdown of 2008. But that's another example of, do we need to be regulated because we're so selfish, irrational, and greedy that if we don't regulate that selfish, irrational greed, we may end up, completely collapsing the financial market, like what happened in 2008. Here's another prezi that looks at what is the prescribed role of the government in the economy, and we're going to look at Canada again, and we're going to look at some of the things the government does do in the Canadian economy. So, for example, here in Canada, we have wage and price control. We have minimum wage laws. That's an example of government intervention in the economy. So when you're writing an essay and you're like, okay, I want to say the government has a role to play in the economy, but I don't have anything concrete or precise to talk about, these are all examples of concrete, precise things you can talk about. The Canadian government regulates the price of many essential products like telephones, electricity, and water. And maybe they should regulate telephones even more because, those bills are quite high. But sometimes those who are being regulated, like Canadian farmers, want to be deregulated. And that's what happened with the Canadian Wheat Board in 2011. Economic security. We must ensure the supply of essential services. So in Canada, that means education is an essential service. It's a public service, and the government has an invested interest in making sure that we secure the supply of that. Welfare, healthcare, and in BC, we have insurance through the ICBC. Protection of economic liberty is another responsibility. We must create legislation that protects your personal and private property. If we don't have legislation that protects your personal and private property, and somebody, with a weapon can come and just take from you, and that's a lawful thing to do, well, that destroys the incentive to create wealth, to accumulate personal and private property. So government, even in a capitalist economy, must create legislation to protect the fruits of your labor. Landlord-Tenant Act, antitrust laws. We pass legislation to protect consumers and producers. So when you buy products, it often has like a CSA label on it, that it's been certified to be safe. That's a consumer safety. We stabilize the economy through fiscal and monetary policy, like Keynes talked about. Remember, I mentioned in a previous lesson the idea that in good times we tax and we lower government spending, and in bad times we spend and we lower taxes. That's fiscal policy. One of the roles government can play in the economy is stabilizing the economy through fiscal policy. There's lots of forms of taxation. We can encourage steady, sustainable growth shared by all Canadians. That's an argument, right? And then from that, how do we do that? Transfer of cash to consumers. EI, pensions, welfare are used to influence the economy and to equalize incomes and try to ensure that most Canadians, hopefully at some point all Canadians, can be above the poverty line. Government is also the largest purchaser of goods here in Canada. Whether they purchase through the military contract, you need to buy airplanes. Do we buy from Bombardier from Quebec or Boeing from Washington State? That's going to impact Canada's economy. Provide employment insurance. They sell bonds. Established in 1966, the Canada Pension Plan was one of many steps the Canadian governments took to play a more active role in the economy. In 1968, the federal government enacted universal medical care insurance. 1971, unemployment insurance coverage was extended to include maternity and sickness leaves. Process began as a result of the Great Depression, starting with the 1940 Unemployment Insurance Act and the 1946 Canadian Mortgage Housing Corporation. Canada also offers old age security to guaranteed income to seniors. What we're seeing here, what this whole thing is showing right now, is Canada shifting towards modern economic liberalism. That's not just freedom in the marketplace, it's freedom through government action. So we also have crown corporations, corporations that may exist to create profit that can be used to fund some of those government agencies. Crown corporations are involved in the generation of electricity, the sale and distribution of alcohol, postal service in Canada, and the lottery. Following the neoconservative agenda starting in the mid-1980s, many crown corporations were privatized, especially right here in Alberta, including in Alberta Government Telephones, AGT, 1991. But also federally, we saw CNR, Petro-Canada, and Air Canada all privatized. What else could the government do in the economy? They could coordinate, sometimes even fund entrepreneurship, research, and innovation so that Canada can be, on the cutting edge of the 21st century global economy. Canada's government also is our international brand representative or ambassador, that when our government travels to countries like India and China, they represent us. And as they travel there, they can often create export opportunities for our corporations if they represent us in a way that attracts business. So in the past, they've signed things like NAFTA and GATT. At least 1 in 3 jobs in Canada in our private sector depends upon international trade. We export more than $300 billion of goods per year. I'm going to skip those videos, and that's basically the end of the educational part of that Prezi. There's some that you can go back to and look at if you wish, but I'm going to go back to that lesson 8 now and kind of look at some big picture stuff and look at some specific case studies. So what role should the government play in the economy? Well, as silly as it sounds, recently with COVID, we had our own crisis, and the crisis might be over things like toilet paper. And we saw within the irrational reaction of mankind over, oh man, we need to buy up all the toilet paper. Does the government need to regulate toilet paper? Can the government regulate our irrational consumer tendencies? There might be some things that, due to the environmental impact or due to the protest, the government needs to get involved as a part of the solution. So we have some links here to anti-pipeline protests. There's some more information about product safety. And this is the number of people saved by safety belts or saved by airbags or motorcycle helmets. These are the number of people that could be saved if we changed the drinking age. Again, healthcare is a recurring theme this year, so we got some numbers here to show you how Canada ranks in terms of our healthcare. Not as strong as you might think. Here again is some numbers that show what some of the major countries are spending on healthcare, and we saw a number like this before that was surprising to show that America was spending the most. Here's a cartoon that is critical of the U.S. system of healthcare because in it, the patient is being blocked. They can't really have the doctor and nurse attend to them because the patient is being blocked by all this corporate and insurance presence within the health industry, getting in the way of the actual process. There's another cartoon being critical, but this time it's being critical of socialized healthcare because they're suggesting socialized healthcare is a lower standard of healthcare, that everybody gets access to it, but everybody just gets 2 aspirin and call me in the morning. A very simple solution. So here's some videos to give you some more information about healthcare. And again, I keep going with healthcare as our case study because unfortunately, as Canadians, you're going to spend some time in the healthcare system. And also, it's going to be a great case study for you on an economic essay to really distinguish between should we have individualism or collectivism. So do go down some of those rabbit holes and see a little bit more. Another role the government can play in the economy is to deal with child welfare. Come to the aid of those in most need. Unfortunately, in the past, without government aid, there have been times when people become so desperate, as this article shows, that they had to put their children up for sale in the United States. So when parents are at the point where they're putting children up for sale because there's no support for them, perhaps there needs to be a change in our relationship with government. There's some stats about poverty here as well that we can look at. And then finally, we compare Canada to some other countries. Could we potentially be more socialist? And there's some information here about Bernie Sanders, the very famous socialist-leaning American politician who would like to become president. There's also an intellect called Noam Chomsky that is a good reference to learn more about socialism. So here's some excellent short videos to look at in terms of learning more about socialism. I do have a Prezi about Sweden. So Sweden doesn't have to be on the multiple choice exam, but many people like to use Sweden on their essay to say, you know what, I'm going to write a Goldilocks economic essay. Canada may not be enough, may not be the just right, so I'm going to use Sweden instead. So in a Goldilocks essay, they might say, America, the 1920s, not enough government intervention. Soviet Union of the 1930s, too much government intervention. Sweden, just right. So if you feel the pull to use Sweden as your case study, I've included some research here that you can do so that you can use Sweden in your economic essays. Now, one of the big questions, recurring themes, that you can break down almost every essay to is freedom versus control. What is the more desirable relationship we need to have with our government? Can mankind be free, or do we need to be controlled? And there's some links here for that. And unfortunately, there's always some case studies in the news that really pull you towards one or the other. So here there's a story coming from Edmonton about a local restaurateur that his kitchen was infested with mice and cockroaches, and that cockroaches and mice were getting into the food, and the consumers didn't realize it. So that's why we have Alberta Health Services. That's why we have a Public Health Act. And that's why there is a code for food and retail and food services, is because unfortunately the problem that Upton Sinclair exposed in the jungle still existed in Canada, in Edmonton of 2017. And that's why government must regulate the economy, because by nature, mankind can be irrational. We can, have a food service industry where people are, feeding you one thing when you think it might be something else. All right, I'll see you next time.